Welcome to Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. During the past few weeks, Sir Henry shared his experiences as a medical practitioner, educator and public orator. In this program, Sir Henry focuses on post-retirement.
I have had so many other interests in life, although I've dedicated my career to medicine and healthcare. And I've obviously talked a lot about the various aspects of medicine and healthcare that I've enjoyed. But at the same time, I'm fundamentally a humanist. I had to adapt to the concept of caring for sick people, get around the issues I had with blood and needles when I was a teenager, and become a doctor. But at the same time, I very much enjoy all of the aspects of the humanities. I grew up drawing and painting. I grew up writing, wanting to write. I had an absolute passion for history. I would have been a historian, except that I thought as a youth that the only way a historian can practice is to teach children about history, and I didn't want to do that. So I wasn't going to be a historian, but I had all of these interests in art, writing, history, architecture, buildings, and so on. And my development of a practical approach to architectural history and preservation began in a very interesting way. Back in 1980, I was flying out to San Diego to give a paper at a medical conference, one of my pharmacology conferences. And as I got on the plane to leave Barbados for Miami to catch another plane for California, I bought my Advocate newspaper in the airport. I sat in my seat, settled myself, took out the newspaper, and on the front page was the headline, "Government to buy Jewish synagogue." And I read this article, and I very quickly discovered that government was going to buy the synagogue, demolish the synagogue, and build over the synagogue in the graves of those Jews who'd lived hundreds of years ago. And I cried out, I said, "What?" And two hostesses came from either side of the plane. They thought I was ill or something. Well, I felt as if I would have a stroke at this kind of news, this kind of sacrilege. How could government possibly do that? Well, I couldn't do anything about it at the time, but obviously I thought about it all the time. And I went to San Diego, and at the time, after my conference, I was going on through Canada on what we called in medicine a bus stop lecture tour. And so in San Diego, I took an afternoon off for the conference because a brochure in the hotel talked about historic San Diego city center. And I went down there, and what I saw were 2 or 3 old Spanish buildings which were tourist traps selling all kinds of ceramics and weaves and things like that. And there wasn't much else. Right behind the 2 or 3 old buildings in this center were the skyscrapers and the city of San Diego. From there I went up to San Francisco because I was buying equipment out of San Francisco. And the San Francisco environment impressed me with the very old Victorian era buildings that were beautifully preserved, and the ancient tram lines that went up and down the hills of San Francisco. That impressed me. But more than anything else, when I went to Vancouver, where I was giving a lecture in Vancouver, the evening before the lecture, after my arrival, I was taken by my host down into what they called Gastown. And Gastown was the old waterfront where the warehouses were, just like our waterfront with warehouses. But instead of being abandoned and ignored, the waterfront in Gastown, all of those warehouses had been converted into restaurants, high-class shops, a theater, a cinema. There were all of the things that visitors wanted to enjoy, with the water on the side and the restaurants and so on. And I was very impressed because this was a place that was packed with tourists all evening. Before our dinner, after our dinner, there were just people walking up and down enjoying the ambience of all of these converted warehouses. I moved on from Vancouver to Vancouver Island. And very much the same thing there, where the Victorian buildings were the prize of the city centre in Vancouver Island. And from there, I went right across Canada, giving lectures in Saskatchewan, in London, Ontario, in Toronto, and in Montreal. And wherever I went, I found that the Canadians had become excited about their heritage, excited about the history and the buildings that they wanted to preserve because of the stories they told. And I was in a restaurant where you had to exit the restaurant through a bookshop, and there displayed on a table was a new book called Historic London. That's London, Ontario. And I opened this book and I looked at some of the drawings. It was lovely drawings, about 100 of them, of 100 historic buildings. And they started with the oldest building in London, Ontario. And I remember vividly, the date was the 1830s. And I said to my host, you know, this oldest building that they're so proud of is the 1830s. In Barbados, we have a Jewish synagogue 200 years older, 1654, which the government wants to demolish. Well, I flew down back to Barbados, and on the plane I wrote an article. And when I got here, I gave it to the Bayesian magazine run by my friend, the now late Gwen Reeder, and my sister Roslyn worked with her, and Patrick Hoyas worked with her. And they published this article, which I call Our Architectural Heritage, an SOS. It's published in the Bayesian magazine, and it was picked up and read by Caroline Barrow, the wife of Prime Minister Errol Barrow. And she was excited about this. And I went on Rediffusion twice in long talk programs with Caroline Barrow, promoting the concept of our heritage and talking against the purchase of the synagogue and building over the cemetery. And that led eventually, a couple of years later, to the purchase of the synagogue by the Jewish community of Barbados, led by Sir Paul Altman. And we had enormous satisfaction, Paul and I, in the fact that Mr. Adams agreed to allow the Jewish community to restore the synagogue and to vest it forever in the Barbados National Trust. But it was the beginning of my passionate championing and advocacy of our history and our heritage. The built heritage being the physical way of telling the story of the past, telling the story, in the case of the synagogue, of the Jews, other places that told the story of our Parliament and our heroes in Parliament. You know, when you walk up the steps of the Parliament buildings to the House of Assembly, at the top is the famous Sir Conrad Reeves, who helped to preserve the power of the legislature and to stop Barbados from becoming a much more simple colony with less rights. So buildings tell that story, and I always say that history is his story or her story. That's how the word was derived. And different historians, of course, have different versions of history. So the history of Barbados may be told by Dr. X or by Dr. Y, and so it may be Dr. X's story and Dr. Y's story, and we have to synthesize it all and look at the evidence. And I got very interested in the history of our buildings. And I always say that research requires the same components, whether you're going to be a microscopist, a biological genetic researcher, or whether you are working in medicine or history or language or anything else. You have to have the curiosity. You have to ask the right questions. You have to research it and acquire evidence that can then be validated by you or someone else. So the concept of doing research applies equally, whatever the discipline, even though the details of the technology will be very, very different. Anyway, I got so interested that I started looking into the old buildings of Barbados. And being an artist, I started drawing them. I used a pen and wash technique with black ink or sepia, and I produced all of these wonderful drawings, in my view, of old buildings, old houses, townhouses, chattel houses, mansion houses, churches, and so on. And I went to a publisher, and the publisher I chose was the Barbados National Trust. And the Barbados National Trust at the time had as its president Paul Foster, as its director Sir Donald Wiles, and they agreed to publish my first book, Historic Houses of Barbados. And on the strength of that book, I was persuaded to become a member of the Council of the National Trust, and within a very short time I literally became the voice of the National Trust for the preservation of our fabric of historic buildings, whatever they were, all over. And I started promoting the Chattel House as a result of a conversation I had with Ilombe Motley. Ilombe Motley said, you know, the National Trust talks about the great houses, and you have fundraisers at great houses, as if that was the only important part of Barbadian architecture. What are you doing about the Chattel House? Well, in fact, Jimmy Walker had had a similar idea, and Jimmy and Paul and I helped, and my landscaper, my gardener, actually helped to paint an old house on Tudor Bridge, which was a model for a Chattel House. And the old gentleman said, I'm happy for you to paint it. Of course he was. We painted it, made it look a lot better, publicized it, and when he died, Paul and Jimmy negotiated with the heirs that they would acquire that Chattel House. And that Chattel House is now at Tyrrell Court. It was briefly accommodated at Welch's, Jimmy Walker's home, but it's now the Chattel House Museum at Tyrrell Court. And my promotion of the Chattel House went a long way. What happened after the production of the book, and I then did a second edition which I produced with the National Trust again in 1985, and after that, Sisson Spaints came to me and said, would I work with CBC TV to produce a series of films on the architecture of Barbados? So that was my first venture into serious filming. I'd done a few talks on health, but this was serious work now. And I did all of the work for a series of programs called Treasures of Barbados. It was very exciting. Treasures of Barbados was my concept of the Japanese approach to living treasures, things that need to be preserved. Treasures, of course, are always valuable, and I was making the point that the architecture of Barbados over several hundred years was of great value, and we were not taking it seriously. So I began with the iconic St. Nicholas Abbey.
St. Nicholas Abbey is a Jacobean house, a term used to describe houses built in Britain between the reigns of James I and Charles II in the middle of the 17th century. Only 3 such houses survive in the entire Western Hemisphere. One is Bacon's Castle in Virginia, and the other 2 are both in Barbados. St. Nicholas Abbey, which you see here, and Drax Hall, and both are older than Bacon's Castle. Facts which make Barbados of considerable importance in the world of historic buildings. What most distinguishes Nicholas is the roofline. These elegant curvilinear gables at the front and sides, the tall ornate chimney pieces, and the decorative finials. These sculptures along the roof, between the gables, and at the top of the gable ends. Also the very tall, dignified shape of the house, and the rich pattern of the plaster coins around the windows and at the corners of the building. Many of these features were borrowed from Dutch architecture, especially the gables, known as Dutch gables.
You know, there is no more beautiful, interesting, historic site in the entire Caribbean than St. Nicholas Abbey. It literally has everything now for the family, because the children love the historic train ride and the rum refinery, the rum distillery that Larry Warren has produced, the restoration of the house, the beautiful gardens, the gully, the landscaping, the rum tasting. Everything at St. Nicholas Abbey is 5-star. And I began with the story about St. Nicholas Abbey. And I moved directly from St. Nicholas Abbey to give the contrast of the story of the Chattel House. So I developed a storyline, beginning with the slave huts that exist in places like Moores Hill on the Nicholas property originally. And then we moved on to the early Chattel houses, the very, very old ones, the beautiful ones that survive, having been built with Panama money, the improved Chattel houses, and told the whole story of the Chattel House.
The term Chattel House is an archaic or old-fashioned term. By definition, chattel means movable, or part of a man's goods and chattels, which can be moved from place to place. It's a common term in the King James Version of the Bible. In the old days, changing your job meant moving your house. And so every section of the house would have to be taken down and stacked up, one section on another. In the old days, it would have been moved on a mule cart or an ox cart. Today, it would be moved on a truck. A house grows by the addition of new units, one behind the other, like a stack of cards. Usually, the unit or house behind the first one, or front house, is wider to allow front ventilation and a central corridor. Finally, and traditionally, the last unit usually has a flat roof and was known as the shed roof or shed roof. Occasionally, the house grew to a much greater size with the addition of a two-story portion, like this very much larger house at Wildy.
And then we went right down the line, talking about historic Bridgetown, talking about historic Speightstown, talking about the fortifications and the churches and so on. And that was tremendous, and it really made people wake up to the value of what we had. And I think it made an enormous difference also to the image that people had of the National Trust, because it wasn't just about great houses, it was about the whole fabric, including the Garrison. One of the programs, of course, was about the Garrison.
Garrison means both a fortified place and a supply of soldiers, and that's just what St. Anne's Garrison was. It was in fact the headquarters of the British Armed Forces in the Caribbean, and by 1824 it was more or less complete, with this impressive main guard, the elegant clock tower, and barracks for almost 2,000 soldiers. The old stone barracks, the drill hall, and across the savannah, behind all the evergreen trees we're so familiar with, those red brick barracks for soldiers.
And in that era, Jill Shepherd and Warren Alleyne had written a book about the Garrison, the historic buildings there, which was a great resource for me, so that I didn't have to go to the archives to do all of the research. I could do everything for these films in the most magnificent, dramatic way, because each film was developed between a Sunday afternoon and a Tuesday a week and 3 days later. What would happen was that I would go out on a Sunday afternoon and I would visit the sites that I planned to write about. I would then come home on a Sunday night and I would write my script. And I wrote a script which had to have two versions, one for me and one for the director, who was Betty Lynch. And she was a wonderful person to work with, because like Sherwood McCaskey, she gave me my head. She let us do whatever she felt I could do. She said I was a born TV director, film director. And so, having written the script on a Sunday night, I would then talk to her about it, and we would do initially a reconnaissance where we'd go to the sites and decide what and where we would film. And after 3 weeks, she said, we don't need to do that anymore. We will just come on a Wednesday morning when you take your Wednesday morning off from the hospital. Now, you see, the university provided all faculty members with what they called 2/11ths for private work, because university salaries were just a little more than secondary school salaries. They were not the salaries of consultants in private work. They were not the salaries of doctors in private practice. And therefore the university always recognized that university academics had a role to play with the public. And they said, we will allow you 2/11ths. That means 2 half days out of the 5.5 working days in the week. We'll allow you 2/11ths for private consulting work, for whatever you want to do that is not part of your academic teaching and research. I only did one of those sessions, seeing some private patients one afternoon a week. So my other session I devoted to filming for 3 months. And later on, when I became president of the National Trust, I devoted that other session to simply working in the office with the director of the National Trust. And I have devoted that other session of mine always to public service. So making those films was great fun. Having filmed all Wednesday morning, we would start filming at 8:30 in the morning, and we would film until lunchtime, usually 1 o'clock. Sometimes it was all on one site, like Nicholas Abbey. Other times we had to go to 3 or 4 sites. So we had to factor in the timing. And I wanted to film certain places with the sun behind this site, and others not. So I would work out a schedule that we could fit as much as we could into 5 hours. And then that was Wednesday. And then the films were shown on the Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. So every Monday afternoon, I went to CBC after work, where Betty stayed on, and at 5 o'clock on a Monday afternoon, we would review the film so that she could make any corrections that I suggested. And then it was shown on the Tuesday night. Well, in fact, we started 3 weeks in advance, so that we were showing things that had been made 3 weeks earlier. And then with delays of holidays, and maybe CBC went on strike or I was ill, I don't know, we would have a delay of a week here and a week there. So the last 2 episodes of Treasures of Barbados were actually previewed and edited 24 hours before they were shown. It was a rather desperate situation. But that was a tremendous piece of work, that film. And I simply couldn't stop after that. From the historic houses of Barbados, I moved to the historic churches of Barbados. I produced the first edition of historic churches. And my plan then was to take a notebook with photographs of an architect called Barbara Hill, who had recently died. And she'd left her notebook with Jill Shepherd, her friend here. And so Jill had suggested to me, why don't you do a book about this, just like historic houses? Because you've got the photographs of Barbara, so you don't need to do all the paintings. You got the photos. And so I produced this book. And I said, now who's going to publish this? We don't have a publisher in Barbados. The Advocate newspaper used to publish things. The Nation hadn't published anything of their own except the newspaper by this time. And the National Trust had published my first 2 books, edition 1, edition 2 of Historic Houses. So I went along and consulted with a lawyer and my accountant, and they said, go ahead. I had this idea of a publishing company. And I called my publishing company Art Heritage Publications, because my idea was that I would publish books about architecture, art, and history. And I would fill a huge gap in Barbados. Well, I produced this book, Historic Churches of Barbados, and my idea was that all of the proceeds would go for church repair. I didn't want to make any money out of it. I, with my financial plan worked out with the accountant, I didn't have any royalties to be paid to me. I simply wanted all of the profits of selling the book to the bookshops who would sell it on to go to repairing various churches. And so I had a deal with Sharon Moravian Church, which Barbara Hill was very fond of and I thought was unique in Barbados. St. John's Parish Church, where I went to church and where I was baptized and where my soul resided. And St. James Parish Church, because St. James Parish Church was where Barbara Hill had worshipped, and it was her favorite Anglican church. And I decided that I would give them all of the proceeds. Well, we had a bookshop chain at the time which had multiple shops and was selling these books like hotcakes. The other shops, Roberts and Cloister, were selling a few, but many, many were sold by this bookshop. And when I heard just before Easter that year that between November and March they had sold almost 1,000 books, a quarter of the print run, and I had borrowed the money to print all these books. You see, it cost $10 a book to print, and so I had borrowed $40,000 to print 4,000 books. So this loan was hanging over my head. In those days, you went to the bank and you got a loan on good surety, and you were paying 10 or 12% for that loan. It was unbelievable. So this was really worrying me. Well, on Monday, Thursday, the day before Good Friday, I wrote three checks for $1,000, which was the supposed profit of the books that had been sold by this chain. And I presented those 3 checks to the priests at those 3 churches. And on the Tuesday after the Easter holiday, those bookshops went bankrupt. So I never received a cent of the proceeds of the sales of 1/4 of those books. And therefore, on the strength of the brilliant marketing that those bookshops had done, I had printed all these books. And therefore, it took me 3 years for the other bookshops, which were not as aggressive in their marketing, to sell the remainder of the books. So I ended up losing a considerable sum of money, paying the interest, the horrendous, extortionate interest on that loan that I had taken out. And I decided immediately, business is not my forte. I cannot subject my wife to any more financial losses, and I promptly therefore shut down the company by that time. We had to do it. So that was my early history in getting into historic preservation.
Although not the initiation Sir Henry had hoped for, he nevertheless persisted with his preservation efforts. That and more will be detailed in the next programme. This has been Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for your time.